By the autumn of 1942, the world was on fire. In the east, Hitler's armies were clawing at the ruins of Stalingrad. In the Pacific, the Japanese flag flew over half an ocean, and in the west, the Allies had no foothold at all. Britain stood alone behind barbed wire and blackout curtains, while America, only months removed from the shock of Pearl Harbor, had yet to fire a shot against the Germans. Something had to change. Inside the war rooms of London and Washington, two men wrestled with the same impossible question: where could the Western Allies strike first? For Winston Churchill, the answer lay across the Mediterranean, in the deserts and cities of North Africa. Before Europe, he told Roosevelt, we must drive the Axis from Africa. It is the soft underbelly. But for the Americans, led by General George C. Marshall, the idea seemed timid. Marshall wanted a direct invasion of France, a hammer blow straight at the heart of the Reich. Churchill, ever the strategist of patience, warned that such an assault would be suicide in 1942. The German army, he argued, was too strong, their defenses too deep. We must learn to crawl before we can walk, he said. And so, after weeks of argument, Roosevelt made his choice. America would join Britain in a gamble, not in Europe, but in Africa. The operation would be called Torch, a name chosen to symbolize light piercing darkness. It would be the first time in history that two nations, separated by an ocean, would launch a coordinated amphibious invasion on another continent. More than 100,000 men, soldiers, sailors, and airmen, would be hurled across the Atlantic to strike at the coasts of French North Africa. Their objectives were simple on paper, but staggering in reality. Seize the ports of Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, neutralize the forces of Vichy France before Germany could react, and then push east into Tunisia to trap Rommel's Africa Corps between two Allied armies. But Torch was more than a military operation. It was a political gamble. The French forces in North Africa, numbering nearly 125,000 men, were loyal to Marshal Philippe Pétain's collaborationist regime in Vichy. No one knew whether they would resist or welcome the invasion. Eisenhower, newly appointed as Supreme Allied Commander for Torch, faced a nightmare scenario. If the French fought back, the entire operation could collapse in blood and chaos before the first German arrived. Still, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed. The risk had to be taken. We must fight somewhere, Roosevelt said, and if we wait for perfect certainty, we will wait forever. Planning began in secrecy in August 1942. The logistics were mind-bending. More than 850 ships would cross the Atlantic, carrying tanks, jeeps, fuel, ammunition, and men, the largest oceanic convoy ever assembled. To conceal their intentions, the fleet would sail from ports as far apart as Norfolk, Glasgow, and Greenock, converging at sea like a colossal armada of ghosts. The men chosen for the assault were green. Most of them had never seen combat. Many were fresh out of training camps in Kansas or California, barely 20 years old. But they were led by commanders whose names would soon become legends: Patton, Anderson, and Eisenhower himself. The British contribution was seasoned and disciplined, forged in years of desert warfare. The Americans brought something else: raw energy and industrial might. Together, they represented two halves of the same dream: to open the road back to Europe. Yet even among the planners, doubt ran deep. The Americans worried about morale. The British worried about betrayal. And in Berlin, Hitler watched with suspicion, convinced that the next Allied move would be in Norway or France, not Africa. Torch's targets were divided into three massive beachheads. The Western Task Force, under General George Patton, would land along the Moroccan coast at Safi, Fidala, and Casablanca. It would be the first all-American amphibious assault of the war, launched from the Atlantic itself, over 4,000 miles from home. To the east, the Central Task Force, commanded by General Lloyd Fredendall, would strike at Oran, and further still, the Eastern Task Force, led by British General Kenneth Anderson, would land at Algiers, supported by commandos and paratroopers. In total, 3 nations, 3 armies, and 3 simultaneous landings, all to unfold within a single dawn. In London, Eisenhower established his headquarters in a nondescript building on Grosvenor Square. The walls were covered in maps of the North African coast, every port, every airfield marked in red. The intelligence picture was grim. Vichy defenses included heavy coastal batteries, hundreds of aircraft, and a small but capable fleet. Worse still, German U-boats prowled the Atlantic routes like wolves. "If the enemy finds us before we land," Eisenhower warned, "torch will end before it begins." He gave his men one order above all others: secrecy. For weeks, the soldiers were confined to camps, forbidden from sending letters or even knowing their destination. When questioned, officers told them only that they were going somewhere sunny. By late October, the fleets were assembled. Convoys stretched across the ocean, a steel bridge of war stretching from America to Africa. Aboard the transports, soldiers played cards, polished rifles, and watched the endless waves. Many believed they were heading for France. Others guessed Greece. Only when the leaflets were handed out did they see the words Morocco, Algeria, and North Africa. For most, it meant nothing, just names on a map. They didn't yet know that they were about to step into history. Back in Berlin, the German High Command still had no idea. Their attention was fixed on Stalingrad and the Caucasus, where their armies were bleeding in the snow. To Hitler, the Western Allies were amateurs, too weak and divided to launch a major offensive. His generals assured him that any invasion would come in 1943 and in Europe itself. "The Americans will not cross an ocean to fight," he sneered. But in the Mediterranean, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were already intercepting frantic Axis messages from Tunisia. Reports of strange radio traffic near Gibraltar, of fleets sighted beyond the horizon. The storm was coming, and no one could stop it. On the night of November 7, 1942, the order was given. At bases from Norfolk to Plymouth, engines rumbled to life. The convoys turned east, their decks lined with tanks and landing craft, the men huddled against the cold spray of the Atlantic. Behind them lay the safety of the Western Hemisphere. Ahead, the unknown. They carried with them the hopes of 2 nations and the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire. In the darkness, one American officer looked out at the endless line of ships cutting through the moonlit sea and whispered, "If the Germans could see this, they'd believe the war is already lost." He wasn't far from the truth. In less than 24 hours, the Axis would wake to an impossible reality: 100,000 Allied soldiers landing in Africa overnight, and with them, the dawn of the world's turning tide. In the early hours of November 8, 1942, the dark waters off North Africa shimmered with ghostly movement. Out there, under a moon half-veiled by cloud, the greatest amphibious armada the world had ever seen crept silently toward its targets. More than 850 ships stretched across hundreds of miles of sea. Transports, destroyers, battleships, and aircraft carriers, each blacked out to avoid detection. The code name was Operation Torch, but to the men waiting below deck, shivering in their gear, it felt more like Operation Uncertainty. For most of them, this was their first time in combat. They were farm boys from Iowa, machinists from Detroit, college students from Boston. Young men who had never seen a desert or even heard of the places they were about to invade. Casablanca, Oran, Algiers. Shortly after midnight, small landing craft were lowered into the churning sea. The soldiers climbed down rope ladders, their helmets glinting in the faint light, rifles strapped to their backs. Waves slapped the sides of the craft as engines sputtered to life. "Remember," an officer shouted over the wind, "they might shoot, but they might not." That uncertainty hung heavier than the salty air. No one knew if the French defenders on shore, soldiers of the Vichy regime, would resist or surrender. The Allies had gambled everything on the hope that they wouldn't fight. At Casablanca, the westernmost point of the invasion, General George S. Patton stood on the bridge of his command ship, binoculars fixed on the dim horizon. The time was 6 a.m. "Land," someone said quietly. A faint line of dunes emerged from the fog. Patton nodded once. "Send them in." With that, the first wave of American landing craft roared forward. Almost immediately, French coastal batteries opened fire. Shells howled over the water, geysers erupting near the boats. The Americans returned fire from the battleship USS Massachusetts, her 16-inch guns thundering in answer. The night was torn apart by flame and noise. "So much for no resistance," Patton muttered. Off Oran, the story was the same. The Central Task Force, carrying mostly U.S. troops under General Lloyd Fredendall, ran headlong into the guns of the Vichy defenders. French destroyers charged from the harbor, trading salvos with British cruisers. Two American destroyers, Woolsey and Benson, gunned their engines straight into the port, landing commandos under heavy fire. In the chaos, French gunners mistook Allied landing craft for German raiders and raked the beaches with machine gun bursts. Many of the first-wave troops died before setting foot on land. But at Algiers, the easternmost landing, fortune turned. Here, the Eastern Task Force, a mix of British and American units, met far less resistance. A small underground network of pro-Allied French officers had launched a coup hours before the invasion. They seized key government buildings, sabotaged communications, and arrested several Vichy leaders, creating just enough confusion for the British to storm the beaches almost unopposed. By mid-morning, Allied flags were flying over the port of Algiers. It was the first clear success of the day. Back in the Atlantic, the scale of the operation became apparent. By noon, more than 100,000 Allied troops had landed across 3 countries, an achievement so massive that even the Germans refused to believe the first reports. And Berlin, the High Command dismissed them as Anglo-American propaganda. Only when intercepted radio transmissions confirmed the truth did panic begin to spread through the corridors of power. Field Marshal Kesselring sent urgent cables to Rome. "Enemy landings on a vast scale. We have been caught unprepared." On the ground, the fighting was brutal but short. At Casablanca, Patton's men stormed through beach obstacles under relentless fire. French tanks counterattacked only to be pounded by naval artillery from offshore. By the afternoon of November 10th, Casablanca surrendered. At Oran, the French defenders fought valiantly but hopelessly. When Allied bombers swooped low over the harbor, dropping fragmentation bombs, the resistance collapsed. That same night, Oran fell. But it was at Algiers that the fate of the entire operation was decided. There, a bold diplomatic move ended the bloodshed. American envoy Robert Murphy and British General Mark Clark met secretly with Admiral François Darlan, commander-in-chief of all Vichy forces in North Africa. Darlan was a controversial figure, a loyalist to Pétain, but also a pragmatist. Surrounded, outnumbered, and facing the inevitable, he struck a deal. In exchange for retaining temporary authority, he ordered all French forces to cease resistance and join the Allies. When the news reached the front lines on November 11th, fittingly Armistice Day, gunfire across North Africa fell silent. The campaign that could have drowned in blood had instead ended in negotiation. Overnight, the Allies controlled an entire continent. In 3 days, they had achieved what Napoleon, the Kaiser, and even Hitler had never done: an unopposed transoceanic invasion that seized 1,500 miles of coastline. For the German High Command, the shock was immediate and devastating. Hitler reportedly slammed his fist on the map table, shouting, "So, the Americans have come!" Within hours, he ordered German and Italian divisions to rush into Tunisia by air and sea. "Hold Africa," he commanded. But the Allies had already secured their foothold. The impossible had been done. When the smoke cleared, the beaches of Morocco and Algeria were littered with the debris of war: broken landing craft, burnt-out vehicles, and the bodies of the young men who had paid the first price of America's European war. But for every life lost, the message was clear: the Western Allies were finally in the fight. One British correspondent, standing among the wreckage at Fadala, wrote in his notebook, "The sea is still full of ships, more ships than the eye can count. It is as if the ocean itself has risen to make war. He was right. On those November days in 1942, the Atlantic quite literally came alive, carrying with it the promise of liberation and the beginning of the end for the Axis in Africa.
In Berlin, disbelief quickly turned to fury. When Hitler learned that more than 100,000 American and British troops had landed in North Africa in just 3 days, he refused to accept it at first. "Impossible," he snapped at his generals. "The Americans are amateurs. They couldn't have done this without the British holding their hand." But within hours, new intelligence reports poured in. Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers had fallen. The French fleet was neutralized. And Admiral Darlan, the man Hitler had trusted to keep North Africa under Vichy control, had switched sides. The Führer's face turned pale with rage. "If France will not hold Africa, then Germany will." That same day, November 11th, 1942, Hitler ordered Case Anton, the full occupation of Vichy France. German tanks rolled across the demarcation line that had divided the country since 1940, seizing Toulon, Marseille, and Lyon. The illusion of French independence vanished overnight. The remaining Vichy government became a puppet in name only. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe scrambled to respond to the Allied invasion. Within 48 hours, German and Italian transports began ferrying troops from Sicily and southern Italy into Tunisia. Paratroopers of the elite Fallschirmjäger units landed near Tunis, while columns of tanks and artillery disembarked at Bizerta. The race for North Africa had begun. For Eisenhower, now coordinating the next phase of Torch, it was the worst possible outcome, and exactly what he had feared. The Germans had reached Tunisia faster than expected. They now controlled key ports and airfields, establishing a defensive wall that blocked the Allies from advancing east. Eisenhower wired London, "Enemy reacting with speed and determination. Situation extremely fluid. We may have to fight for every mile." In those first weeks after the landings, the Allies found themselves in a nightmare of logistics. Their supplies were still being unloaded from ships hundreds of miles to the west. The roads through Algeria were narrow, muddy, and clogged with vehicles. Rain turned the desert into a swamp. Patton's armored units could not reach the front in time, and British reinforcements from Egypt were too far away to help. Rommel, though retreating from El Alamein, was still a formidable opponent, and now he had fresh German reinforcements pouring into Tunisia under General Jürgen von Arnim. By late November 1942, Tunisia became the new battleground. The war that had begun with beaches and diplomacy now turned into a brutal contest of endurance. The Germans quickly organized defensive lines in the mountains, supported by seasoned panzer divisions. Luftwaffe aircraft struck Allied convoys by day and night, turning the skies over Algeria into a deadly gauntlet. American troops, still inexperienced, were about to face their first major test against the Wehrmacht. At the same time, political chaos simmered beneath the surface. Admiral Darlan, the very man whose deal had ended French resistance, was assassinated in Algiers in December 1942 by a young French monarchist. The power vacuum threatened to destabilize the entire Allied position. Eisenhower, pragmatic as always, pressed on. "We cannot let politics distract from the mission. Our job is to drive the Germans out of Africa, nothing less." The Germans, meanwhile, treated Tunisia as sacred ground. To them, it was the last defensive barrier between the Allies and southern Europe. The terrain was perfect for defense: steep hills, narrow passes, and endless olive groves that concealed gun emplacements. Rommel, now commanding a hybrid German-Italian force, dug in along the Mareth Line, a series of fortifications originally built by the French in the 1930s. He knew his back was to the wall, but he intended to make the Allies pay dearly for every step forward. The winter of 1942-1943 in Tunisia was cold and wet. The Americans learned hard lessons about desert warfare. Supply lines stretched thin, fuel convoys bogged down in mud, and communication between British and American commands was clumsy. Many of the Green U.S. units still used outdated tactics better suited for training grounds than battlefields. The Germans, by contrast, fought with ruthless efficiency. They launched sudden counterattacks that encircled Allied columns and ambushed convoys. The Americans called them ghost attacks, invisible until the guns opened up. Yet even as they stumbled, the Allies adapted. They built airfields in record time, allowing squadrons of Spitfires and P-38 Lightnings to challenge German air superiority. Engineers repaired bridges under fire, while convoys of trucks, the early version of what would become the famous Red Ball Express, began moving supplies forward. Every day, more ships arrived at Algiers and Oran, unloading tanks, artillery, and fresh troops. The industrial power of the United States was beginning to flex its muscle. By January 1943, the balance had begun to shift. The Allied front stretched eastward through the Atlas Mountains, and Eisenhower's headquarters in Algiers buzzed with new confidence. But in February, disaster struck. The Germans launched a massive counteroffensive near Kasserine Pass, catching American forces off guard. Tanks of the 10th Panzer Division tore through U.S. lines, scattering inexperienced units and forcing a hasty retreat. For the first time, American troops faced the full fury of German mechanized warfare, and they were crushed. It was a humbling moment. Nearly 6,000 American casualties, hundreds of vehicles destroyed, and an army forced to retreat in confusion. The press back home called it a lesson in arrogance. But Eisenhower and his commanders learned quickly. They replaced ineffective officers, reorganized logistics, and adopted British combat doctrine. And when General George S. Patton was given command of the battered Second Corps, everything began to change. The Kasserine defeat, as painful as it was, forged the Americans into a fighting force that would soon turn the tide. In the months ahead, the same divisions that had fled in panic would march east again, this time with discipline, confidence, and overwhelming firepower. The Germans, who had once mocked the Green Americans, would learn that they had awakened a giant. For now, however, in late February 1943, Tunisia remained a cauldron. The outcome was uncertain, the cost heavy. But the landing of November 1942 had achieved what it set out to do. It had forced Hitler to divide his strength, stretch his supply lines, and fight on yet another front. Torch had lit the flame. Soon that flame would burn across all North Africa.
By March 1943, the rains had begun to fade, and the mountains of Tunisia, barren, rugged, and red with clay, became the stage for one of the most decisive chapters of the North African campaign. The Allied armies, still stung by the humiliation at Kasserine Pass, were no longer the same inexperienced force that had stumbled into the desert months before. Under the steel discipline of General George S. Patton and the coordination of British General Bernard Montgomery, they were now a machine learning to fight, move, and kill as one. The men who had once been green recruits were now hardened veterans. And across from them, the once invincible Africa Corps, led by the legendary Erwin Rommel, was running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, and hope. When Patton arrived to take command of the battered U.S. Second Corps in late February, his presence was electric. "I don't want to hear the word defense again," he barked at his officers. "From now on, we attack." He made the men shave, polish their helmets, and keep their weapons spotless. "A dirty soldier is a lazy soldier," he told them. But beneath the bluster, Patton was a realist. He knew that the Americans could not win by numbers alone. They had to outthink and outmaneuver the Germans. The lesson of Kasserine had been clear: arrogance and confusion kill faster than bullets. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, Rommel was a shadow of his former self. The desert fox who had once danced circles around the British at Tobruk and Gazala now commanded a shrinking army. His once proud Africa Corps, battered by years of fighting and strangled by Allied naval power, had been reduced to a few divisions holding the hills of Tunisia. Reinforcements from Italy trickled in too slowly, and fuel convoys from Sicily were sunk almost as soon as they left port. Rommel's letters to Berlin grew desperate. "Without supplies, we cannot hold Tunisia for long. The enemy grows stronger daily." The Allies knew it. Operation Torch had given them the foothold. Now they meant to close the trap. To the east, Montgomery's 8th Army, fresh from victory at El Alamein, advanced from Libya. To the west, Patton's 2nd Corps and Anderson's British 1st Army pushed through the passes of western Tunisia. The plan was simple and brilliant:
squeeze Rommel's forces between them like a hammer and an anvil. The decisive clash came at El Guatar, a dry valley surrounded by low ridges and cactus-covered hills. It was there, on March 23, 1943, that Rommel launched one final desperate offensive to break the Allied line. At dawn, the desert shook under the roar of German Panzer IVs and Tiger tanks. The Americans dug into defensive positions with their M3 Lee and M4 Sherman tanks braced for impact. For many of them, it was the first time they had faced a full-scale German armored assault. The opening hours were chaos. The German tanks smashed through the forward infantry lines, their 88mm guns ripping through the thin armor of the M3s. But this time, the Americans didn't panic. Artillerymen of the 9th Field Artillery Battalion opened fire with their 105mm howitzers, their shells screaming down in perfect arcs. Entire German platoons disappeared in bursts of sand and fire. One gun crew fired over 900 rounds in a single day, turning their barrels red-hot. Patton's tankers counterattacked with Shermans, maneuvering across the ridges in disciplined formations. The air above the valley filled with the whine of P-38 Lightnings and Spitfires, strafing the advancing panzers. Rommel's attack faltered. By noon, more than 30 German tanks were burning on the plain. The Afrika Korps fell back, pursued by Allied artillery fire that turned retreat into rout. It was not a massive battle by the standards of the war, but its significance was enormous. For the first time, American forces had met the Wehrmacht head-on and won. The myth of German invincibility in North Africa was shattered. Patton visited the front the next day, his boots caked in dust and his pearl-handled revolver glinting in the sun. He stood among the wreckage of destroyed German tanks and said quietly to his aide, "This is what learning looks like." The men around him, exhausted but elated, knew he was right. They had proven that they could fight, and more importantly, that they could win. As March turned to April, the Allied noose around Tunisia began to tighten. British, American, and Free French units advanced steadily toward the coast. Axis positions were bombarded day and night by Allied air power. Convoys from Italy were annihilated by British submarines in the Mediterranean. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin from Russia to Sicily, could barely contest the skies. Every day, Allied troops captured new positions: Gafsa, Maknassy, Sfax. The road to Tunis lay open. Rommel, his health failing, was recalled to Germany in early March. He left behind General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim to command what remained of Army Group Africa. Arnim's orders were simple: hold Tunisia as long as possible. But it was already too late. The Allies had learned to fight as a team. British coordination, American firepower, and French determination now worked in harmony. On May 7, 1943, American forces under General Bradley entered Bizerte, while the British marched into Tunis. The campaign that had begun 6 months earlier with a desperate gamble across the Atlantic ended in total victory. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, the largest capitulation of German forces since Stalingrad. The Army Group Africa, once proud, ceased to exist. When the news reached London and Washington, church bells rang. Churchill called it a splendid beginning. Roosevelt simply said, "The tide has turned." For the Germans, the loss was catastrophic. North Africa, once seen as a strategic bastion, was gone. The Mediterranean was now an Allied lake. And from their new foothold, the Western Allies were already looking north toward Sicily, Italy, and eventually Europe itself. For the soldiers who had survived Torch, Oran, and El Guatar, the victory was bittersweet. They had paid dearly for it, more than 70,000 Allied casualties across 6 months of brutal fighting. But in their exhaustion, they knew they had changed the war. What began as a risky experiment had become a masterclass in coalition warfare.
The Americans had learned from the British. The British had learned to trust the Americans. Together, they had achieved what neither could have done alone. Standing in the ruins of Tunis, one war correspondent wrote, "The desert smells of smoke and oil, but beneath it there's something else, the smell of victory." And indeed, as the flags of Britain, America, and France rose over the Tunisian hills, the world understood that the war's momentum had finally shifted.
When the guns finally fell silent over Tunisia in May 1943, the world understood that something monumental had shifted. The war that once seemed doomed to drag on indefinitely had found its first clear path to victory. Operation Torch, dismissed by some as a sideshow, had become the spark that reignited Allied momentum. For the first time since 1939, the Axis powers had lost an entire continent. What began as a desperate gamble had evolved into a textbook of modern warfare and a lesson in what cooperation, ingenuity, and moral purpose could achieve. In the days after the final surrender, Allied commanders walked among the endless lines of captured Axis troops, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers, dazed and silent, stretching as far as the eye could see. Among them were veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps, men who had once believed themselves invincible. It was like watching an army dissolve into dust, recalled one British officer. The German high command was stunned. In private, Hitler raged that Africa has become our graveyard. But the defeat went beyond numbers. It marked the end of Germany's myth of tactical supremacy and the beginning of America's rise as a global military power. For the Americans, Torch had been a baptism by fire. The early chaos, the green troops at Kasserine, the miscommunications, the logistical nightmares had forced a young army to grow up fast. Under Patton, Bradley, and Eisenhower, the U.S. Army had transformed from an untested force into one capable of matching and outmaneuvering the Wehrmacht. The coordination between air, land, and sea forces in the North African campaign became the foundation for every Allied invasion that followed: Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and beyond. The lessons of Torch were studied in every war college for decades, lessons paid for in blood, but written in victory. Churchill called North Africa the end of the beginning. He was right. The Allied triumph in Tunisia didn't just clear the Mediterranean of Axis power, it opened the road to Europe itself. Within weeks, planning began for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, which would knock Italy out of the war and bring the fight to Hitler's doorstep. The Americans, once reluctant to fight in Africa, now saw its value clearly. Torch, Roosevelt said, proved that democracy can plan, fight, and win. But the victory was more than strategic. It was psychological, a turning point in belief. In 1942, German officers had laughed at the idea that untested American troops could cross an ocean and fight a professional army. 6 months later, those same officers stood behind barbed wire in Allied prison camps, staring at their conquerors in disbelief. One captured German colonel reportedly told his interrogator, "You Americans build armies the way you build cars, faster than we can destroy them." The Allies had not just outnumbered the Axis, they had outplanned and outbuilt them. Torch revealed the staggering depth of Allied logistics. Every gallon of gasoline, every crate of ammunition, every landing craft that came ashore had been carried across 3,000 miles of ocean. The operation demonstrated something Hitler had underestimated: the power of American industry and British organization working in harmony. The German intelligence reports that followed read like confessions of awe. "The enemy's ability to project force is beyond what we imagined," one captured officer wrote. "They have made the Atlantic their highway." For the French, Torch was both liberation and reckoning. The men who had once served Vichy found themselves fighting alongside the Allies against the Germans they had been ordered to cooperate with just months earlier. It was a moral awakening, painful, complicated, but necessary. By the end of the campaign, French forces had rejoined the Allied cause under General Henri Giraud and Charles de Gaulle. The tricolor flag flew proudly again, not as a symbol of collaboration, but of resistance reborn. For Eisenhower, the victory cemented his role as a commander of rare calm and balance. He had navigated political chaos, multinational armies, and battlefield setbacks with unshakable composure. His success in coordinating American, British, and French forces
proved that he could lead not just soldiers, but nations. Torch was his test, and he passed it with distinction. Less than a year later, that same leadership would earn him command of Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The terrain of North Africa became littered with lessons that would define the rest of the war. Engineers perfected amphibious landing techniques. Air crews refined close support tactics. Logistics officers learned to feed and fuel hundreds of thousands of men across continents. Even the smallest details, the shape of landing craft ramps, the timing of naval bombardments, the organization of beachheads, would later decide success on D-Day. Torch was the rehearsal for liberation. Yet beyond the strategy and statistics, the human stories of Operation Torch endure. Soldiers who had never seen combat became veterans overnight. Pilots who flew over Algiers would later lead squadrons over Normandy. Medics who treated the wounded on the beaches of Casablanca would do the same in Italy and France. For them, Africa was the crucible, the place where courage was tested and belief was forged. There were darker lessons too. The campaign exposed the lingering friction between Allied partners, the mistrust between American and British commanders, the rivalry between de Gaulle and Giraud, the ethical compromises made in dealing with Vichy officials. But out of those tensions emerged a new kind of alliance, one that understood that unity was not about perfection, but about persistence. When the last guns in Tunisia went silent, an American war correspondent wrote, "In the desert wind, you can hear the ghosts of men who believed in the impossible and made it happen. The sand will cover their footprints, but not their victory." The strategic map of the world had changed forever. The Axis was now fighting on three fronts: in Russia, in the skies over Europe, and across the Mediterranean. Hitler's dream of empire was collapsing under its own weight. And for the Allies, Africa was not just a battlefield, it was a beginning. From the beaches of Morocco to the mountains of Tunisia, Operation Torch had proven that freedom could fight its way back into a world consumed by tyranny. It had shown that courage and coordination could overcome chaos, and it had turned an ocean into a bridge, one that would soon carry Allied armies to Sicily, to Italy, and finally to the shores of France. As General Eisenhower wrote in his after-action report, North Africa was more than a victory of arms. It was a victory of will, the moment when free men remembered how to win.